Rain always reminds me of that bus stop. Not because anything beautiful happened there, because that was the first place I ever realized my family had already decided who I was long before I got a chance to decide for myself. I was 24 years old, standing under a broken bus shelter in Milwaukee wearing a brand new employee badge around my neck. North Shore Children's Rehabilitation Center. My first real full-time job. It wasn't glamorous. The pay wasn't amazing. But after 6 years of night classes, weekend shifts at grocery stores, and more student loans than I wanted to think about, it felt like I'd finally built something that belonged to me. I kept touching the badge in my pocket during the ride home. Just to make sure it was real, my phone buzzed. Dad calling. I smiled. For one stupid second, I thought he was calling to congratulate me. I answered. Hey, Dad. He didn't say hello. What time do you get off? 5. Good. You'll start watching Ethan tomorrow. I frowned. What? Your brother needs somebody to watch Mason while he gets back on his feet. I leaned against the bus window. Dad, I start orientation tomorrow. So it's a full-time job, he laughed. No job is more important than family. I looked down at my employee badge. I worked 6 years for this. You can get another one. No. Silence. Then he calmly replied, You'll quit tomorrow morning. The bus suddenly felt very quiet. I'm not quitting. Another silence, longer this time. Then he hung up. The next morning I arrived at work 30 minutes early. Not because I had to, because I was terrified I'd somehow lose this opportunity before it even started. The rehabilitation center smelled like coffee, fresh paint, and disinfectant. Children's drawings covered almost every hallway. A little boy in a wheelchair waved at me. I waved back. One of the senior therapists laughed. Careful. What? He'll recruit you into a dinosaur conversation. I can handle dinosaurs. She smiled. You say that now. For the next 8 hours I forgot about everything else. The phone. My family. The pressure. For the first time in years I wasn't somebody's backup plan. I was simply Emily. A professional. Someone who mattered because of what she could do, not because of what people could take from her. That evening I pulled into my apartment complex and immediately noticed Dad's pickup truck, Mom's SUV, my brother Ethan's car. All three parked outside my building. My stomach dropped. They weren't visiting. They'd come together. Dad was already waiting beside the entrance. You ignored my calls. I was working. Exactly. He pointed toward my apartment. We need to talk. Inside, Mom had already made herself comfortable on my couch. Ethan sat scrolling through his phone. He barely looked up. Mom smiled. Congratulations on the job. The words sounded kind. Her eyes didn't. I stayed standing. What do you want? Dad answered. You'll submit your resignation tomorrow. No. Ethan finally looked up. It's only for a few months. Then hire a babysitter. I can't afford one. You can. You just don't want to. Mom sighed dramatically. Emily, your brother's under a lot of stress. So am I. Hay has a child. I have a future. Dad stepped closer. Family comes first. I looked around my tiny apartment. Second-hand furniture, cheap curtains, boxes I still hadn't unpacked. Everything in that room represented years of sacrifice. I've already spent years putting everyone else first. Dad folded his arms. And now it's your brother's turn. No. Ethan stood. You've always been selfish. I actually laughed. I practically raised your son while I was in college. You volunteered. I was told I had no choice. Mom rolled her eyes. There you go again. Keeping score. No. I just finally stopped forgetting. The room fell silent. Dad slowly removed his leather belt. At first, I honestly thought he was just adjusting it. Then he pulled it completely free. The metal buckle hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clang. Mom smiled. Not at me. At Dad. Like she'd seen this scene before. Maybe I'll. She laughed softly. She forgot she's just spare labor. My heart stopped. Spare labor. Not daughter. Not family. Not Emily. Just spare labor. Dad wrapped the belt around his fist. Last chance. Quit. I looked him straight in the eye. No. The first strike hit my shoulder before I could move. The second caught my back. Pain exploded through my body. I stumbled into the dining table. A framed photo crashed onto the floor. Outside, Someone started pounding on my apartment door, not knocking, pounding. Then a voice shouted through the hallway, "Emily, open the door!" It wasn't the police. It wasn't another neighbor. It was Mrs. Alvarez, the 76-year-old apartment manager who had watched me leave for work every morning since I moved in. She'd heard everything, and judging by the panic in her voice, she already knew this wasn't just another family argument. Mrs. Alvarez didn't wait for permission. The pounding stopped. A second later, I heard keys rattling against the lock. Every apartment manager in our building had an emergency master key. Dad heard it too. His eyes snapped toward the door. "Don't." Mrs. Alvarez's voice came through the wood. The apartment became silent. Even Ethan finally stood up. "What?" Mom frowned. She wouldn't. The lock clicked. Mrs. Alvarez pushed the door open just enough to look inside. She wasn't carrying a phone. She was carrying groceries, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, a bag of apples. The second she saw me doubled over beside the dining table, the grocery bag slipped from her hands. Apples rolled across the kitchen floor. She looked at the leather belt still hanging from Dad's hand, then at the red welts across my shoulder. Then quietly asked, "What happened?" Nobody answered. Dad quickly rolled the belt into a loop. "It was a family disagreement." Mrs. Alvarez looked at me instead. "Emily, I couldn't even lift my arm." Before I could finish, she overreacted. Mrs. Alvarez nodded slowly. "I see." Then she looked directly at Dad. "I've managed apartment buildings for 28 years. She pointed toward the belt. "I've never seen a disagreement leave marks shaped like that." Nobody spoke. Dad stepped toward her. "This doesn't concern you." She smiled politely. "It became my concern when your daughter screamed." Mom folded her arms. "Emily has always been dramatic." Mrs. Alvarez didn't even acknowledge her. Instead, she walked straight over to me. Very carefully, she lifted the sleeve of my blouse. The dark red marks were already swelling. Her face changed immediately. "Oh, sweetheart." That was all she said, just, "Oh, sweetheart," and somehow those two words almost made me cry, because unlike my own mother, this woman actually sounded like she cared. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived, not because Mrs. Alvarez exaggerated, because someone on the 3rd floor had also called after hearing shouting. Officer Natalie Brooks looked around my apartment without saying a word. The broken picture frame, the overturned dining chair, the belt lying on the floor, my shoulder. Dad immediately started talking. This got blown out of proportion. Officer Brooks raised one hand. "I'll speak to everyone separately." Dad frowned. "That's unnecessary." "It isn't." She turned toward me. Dad answered before I could. "She's staying here." Officer Brooks slowly looked at him. "No, but she isn't." Mrs. D. Alvarez walked with me into the hallway. The officer closed the apartment door behind us. Then she asked quietly, "Can you raise your right arm?" I tried. Pain shot through my shoulder. I stopped halfway. She wrote something in her notebook. "Has he hit you before?" I didn't answer. Not because I wanted to lie, because I honestly didn't know where to start. Officer Brooks waited, no pressure, no interruptions, just silence. Finally I whispered, "When I was 16. Another silence. "19. I swallowed hard. "And once after college." She nodded slowly. "And today." I looked through the apartment window. Dad was pacing. Mom was talking animatedly. Ethan was staring at his phone, like none of this had anything to do with him. They wanted me to quit my job. Why? So I could babysit my brother's son. Officer Brooks blinked. "Gah, I thought I misheard you." "You didn't." At that exact moment, the apartment door opened again. This time it wasn't my parents. It was Ethan. He looked irritated. "Can we hurry this up?" Officer Brooks turned toward him. "Sir." "My son's daycare closes at 6. I stared at him. Even now, even after everything, his biggest concern was still childcare. Officer Brooks folded her notebook closed, then asked one simple question. "Why can't you watch your own child?" Ethan laughed. "Because I work." Silence. The officer tilted her head. "And Emily doesn't." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Mrs. Alvarez quietly muttered, Finally, about an hour later, I was sitting in the emergency clinic having photographs taken of the injuries. The nurse carefully measured every bruise, every welt, every scrape. She documented everything. When she finished, she looked at me kindly. You know, what? I've photographed hundreds of injuries. She paused. The hardest ones aren't the bruises. They're the people who still think they deserved them. I stared at the floor. Because for years, part of me actually had. The following morning I arrived at work expecting to explain everything to my supervisor. Instead, she was already waiting outside my office. Her name was Linda Chen. She'd spent 30 years working with children recovering from trauma. She took one look at my face, then quietly handed me a mug of coffee. What? You've got enough to carry. I smiled weakly. I'm sorry, she frowned. For what? For bringing this to work. Linda gently shook her head. Emily. She looked around the rehabilitation center where children fought every day to rebuild their lives. We teach kids here that asking for help isn't weakness. She smiled softly. We should probably believe it ourselves. Before I could answer, her office phone rang. She listened for a few seconds, then looked at me. There's someone here asking for you. Who? Linda's expression changed. He says he's your uncle. I frowned. My Uncle Robert died years ago. She slowly shook her head. No. He introduced himself as... She glanced at the note in her hand. Daniel Mercer. He says he has something your grandfather wanted you to have, and he thinks your parents made sure you never knew it existed. I almost told Linda she had the wrong person. I didn't have an Uncle Daniel. At least, I didn't think I did. Are you sure? She handed me the visitor slip. Daniel Mercer. No last name I recognized. No company. Just one sentence written underneath. Tell Emily it's about Frank. Frank. My grandfather. Nobody outside the family ever called him Grandpa. Only Frank. My heart skipped. I'll be on Don waiting in the lobby looked to be in his late 60s denim jacket, sun-faded baseball cap, hands rough enough to belong to someone who'd worked outside his whole life. The second he saw me, he smiled sadly. You've got Frank's eyes. I stopped walking. You knew my grandfather. He nodded. 48 years. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. I frowned. Who are you? He reached into an old leather satchel, pulled out a faded photograph. 2 young men standing beside a construction site. One of them was my grandfather. The other was him. Your grandfather called me his brother. We weren't related, but sometimes family isn't the people who share your blood. It's the people who share your burdens. We sat in a quiet cafe across the street. For almost an hour he told me stories I'd never heard. How Grandpa worked double shifts to keep food on the table. How he'd secretly repaired neighbors' roofs for free after storms. How he refused promotions because they would have taken him away from family. Then Daniel became quiet. There's something else. He slid a sealed envelope across the table. My name, written in Grandpa's handwriting. My hands immediately started shaking. I've never seen this. You weren't supposed to. What? Frank asked me not to give it to you until... He looked down. Unless he believed your parents had started treating you the way they treated his younger sister. I frowned. What does that mean? Daniel sighed. Your grandfather grew up as the spare child. My chest tightened. He told me? Daniel smiled sadly, that he recognized the same pattern happening to you. I couldn't breathe. He was worried enough to write I opened the envelope. The paper smelled old. The ink had faded slightly. Emily, if you're reading this, then I was right about something I prayed I'd be wrong about. Your father always believed responsibility belonged to the strongest child. The strongest child eventually becomes the one everyone expects to sacrifice. Don't let them mistake your kindness for ownership of your life. You are not responsible for carrying adults who refuse to stand. I folded the letter before I finished it, because I couldn't see anymore. Tears blurred every word. Daniel waited quietly. No speeches. No advice, just silence. Sometimes silence is the kindest thing another person can offer. I gonna abionao and I gonna naonao that evening I drove home thinking about Grandpa, about every time he'd quietly slipped me $20 for textbooks, every time he'd whispered, "Don't quit school," every birthday card that always included the exact same sentence, "Build your own life." I never realized those weren't encouraging words. They were instructions. When I reached my apartment, Mrs. Alvarez was watering flowers near the entrance. She smiled. "How was work?" I smiled back. "Different." She noticed the envelope in my hand. "Good different?" "The best kind." She nodded. I figured. Then she handed me a small casserole dish. "What's this?" "Dinner, you don't have to." She interrupted. "I know. But lonely people forget to eat." I laughed through tears. "You always know," she shrugged. "I've been old for a while, now too." 2 weeks later, Dad called. For the first time since the assault, I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered, spoke for several seconds. Finally, he whispered, "I lost Ethan." "What?" "Hay moved." "Where?" "I don't know." Silence. He said if I wasn't paying his bills anymore, Dad swallowed hard. I wasn't useful. Those words hung between us. Useful, not loved, not respected. Useful, exactly how they'd treated me for years. I closed my eyes. The cycle had finally reached the child they'd spent decades protecting. Dad started crying. Real crying. I think we ruined him. I looked at Grandpa's letter sitting on my kitchen table, then quietly answered. Saved him from consequences? And that ruined all of you. Neither of us spoke it in nearly 18 months later. The rehabilitation center held its annual family picnic. Children chased bubbles across the lawn. Parents laughed. Therapists played soccer with kids learning to walk again. Linda found me sitting under a tree. "You look happy." "I am," she smiled. "Different. Very." Across the field I watched Ethan's son, my nephew Mason, running toward me. Not because anyone forced him. Because Ethan had finally agreed to let me be part of his life again. Mason wrapped his arms around my waist. "Aunt Emily." I laughed. "Hey, buddy." He looked up. "Dad says you're helping me build a birdhouse." "I am." He grinned. "I've never built anything." I smiled. Then today seems like a good day to start. As we walked toward the workshop tables, I glanced back toward the rehabilitation center, toward the life I'd almost given up, toward the job my parents said wasn't worth keeping. They believed babysitting my brother was my purpose. They were wrong. My purpose was never to become someone else's spare labor. It was to build a life where children learned they were worth protecting, including the little girl I used to be. And, for the first time, that little girl finally believed it too. The birdhouse still sits on the windowsill in my office. It's crooked. One side leans a little. The roof doesn't quite line up. Mason insisted on painting one wall bright blue and the other green because he couldn't decide which color birds liked more. Every child who visits my office asks about it. I always give them the same answer. My nephew built it. I never tell them it almost never happened. Because there was a time when I thought my entire future ended in that apartment, the night my father wrapped a leather belt around his fist. I couldn't have been more wrong. 3 years passed. The bruises disappeared long before the memories did, but memories have a funny way of changing. The painful ones slowly stop feeling like open wounds. They become road signs reminding you never to go backward. One Friday afternoon, while helping a little girl practice walking again after surgery, my phone vibrated. A message from Mrs. Alvarez. "Someone's waiting downstairs. No pressure. Just thought you should know." I looked through the clinic window. Dad. He looked older than I remembered. His shoulders weren't as straight. His hair had turned almost completely white. He wasn't carrying flowers, he wasn't carrying excuses. He was carrying a cardboard box. "I won't stay long," he said. When I walked outside, I nodded. "Okay." He handed me the box. Inside were things I'd thought were gone forever. My middle school science medal, the acceptance letter from college, my first employee badge from the grocery store where I'd worked nights to pay tuition. Every achievement my parents had packed into attic boxes, while celebrating Ethan's milestones instead. Dad stared at the ground. I found these while cleaning. I picked up the grocery store badge. You kept them? He laughed bitterly. No, I hid them. I looked at him. What? Your mother thought they weren't important. So, I put them in the attic. He swallowed hard. I couldn't stop what was happening. But I couldn't throw away proof that you mattered. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then I quietly asked, why didn't you protect me? His eyes filled with tears. Because every time I should have stood between you and your brother. He looked away. I stood beside him instead. A month later, Ethan asked if we could meet, not at my apartment, not at our parents' house, at a public park. He arrived, pushing Mason on the swings. The little boy ran over the second he saw me. Aunt Emily. I caught him before he could crash into me. He grinned. Dad lets me make my own breakfast now. I laughed. That's progress. It is. Ethan waited until Mason ran toward the playground. Then he spoke. I blamed you for years. I know. I thought Mom and Dad loved me more. He shook his head slowly. They just expected less from me. I stayed quiet. They never taught me how to be responsible. They taught you. They rescued me. I think. He looked at his son. That was the cruelest thing they ever did. For the first time in my life, my brother wasn't asking me to solve his problems. He was taking responsibility for them. It wasn't dramatic. It was something better. It was real. That Christmas, the rehabilitation center held a toy drive for families who couldn't afford presents. Mason spent an hour carefully choosing which toys to donate. Finally, he picked his favorite toy truck. I smiled. Are you sure? He nodded. My dad says keeping everything makes your hands too full to help people. I looked at Ethan. He shrugged. Mrs. Alvarez retired the following spring. The residents threw her a surprise party in the courtyard. When it was my turn to speak, I looked at the woman who had unlocked my apartment door the day my life changed. I used to think heroes looked fearless. Everyone turned toward me. They don't. Sometimes they're 76 years old. They're carrying groceries. And they decide someone else's pain is worth interrupting dinner for. Mrs. Tears, I only used my master key. I smiled. Accorded applause. Used your heart. The entire crowd now. Years later, Mason asked me a question while we were finishing another birdhouse. Aunt Emily. Yeah. Grandpa says families help each other. They should. He looked confused. Then why didn't yours? I thought carefully before answering. Because sometimes people confuse helping with sacrificing. What's the difference? I handed him a small paintbrush. Helping means giving what you can. Sacrificing means someone decides your dreams matter less than theirs. He painted quietly for a minute. Then smiled. I like helping better. So do I. As I locked my office that evening, I looked at the children laughing in the therapy garden. Then at the career my parents once demanded I abandon. Dad beat me because I refused to quit my job. Mom laughed and called me spare labor. They believed my future existed to make someone else's life easier. But they were wrong. I wasn't born to carry my brother. I wasn't born to surrender my dreams. I wasn't born to become someone's backup plan. I was born to build a life that proved every child and every adult deserves to be valued for who they are, not for what they can be forced to give away. And every morning when I clipped my employee badge onto my shirt, I remembered the promise I made to myself at that rainy bus stop years ago. No one would ever decide my worth for me again.